Welcome to Peace Now. My name is Trudy Quaif. I'm a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. We're a local organization of friends and neighbors, and we've been advocating for peace and justice for over 15 years. I'm your host today, and I'm joined by Pippa Bartolotti and Joe Lombardo.
Hi.
Thank you both for joining me. Pippa is a former leader of the Green Party in Wales and England. Joe is currently a member of Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace, and he's co-coordinator of UNAC, which stands for United National Anti-War Coalition. I'm so glad you're both here. Joe and Pippa have been traveling. They've recently come back from Odessa, Ukraine, and they're going to tell us about why they were there. Why did you go to Odessa?
Well, we were invited by some Odessans to come and be international observers for an event that happens every May 2nd. On May 2nd, 2014, right after the coup that took place in Kiev that overthrew the elected government of Ukraine and put in a kind of right-wing government, there have been protests, especially in the south and eastern regions of Ukraine against what happened in Kiev. And the people in Odessa were holding a 24/7 vigil at a place known as the House of Trade Unions against the coup that took place in Kiev. And on May 2nd there had been a soccer game that was taking place there. People came in from out the country, and right-wing and fascist forces mobilized to come to the soccer game, but really with the intent of shutting down that protest. And there had been some fighting between anti-Maidan and Euro-pro-Maidan people in the center of the city, and then they marched to the House of Trade Unions, and people who were at the football game, at the soccer game, joined them, and thousands of people attacked the vigilers at the House of Trade Unions. 48 were killed and over 100 were wounded. The police did not intervene to help the people that were doing the vigiling. And so every May 2nd they hold a memorial. And every May 2nd the right wing and the fascist forces in Ukraine threaten to stop it. So they like to have international observers there at these events. And we came there to be international observers and also to show support for the people of Odessa.
So this massacre happened back in 2014.
Yeah, that's right. And if I may, can I just sort of wind back a bit?
Yes.
Because Odessa is a really beautiful place, and I think often when we get the news, we think of it in terms of Russia versus Europe versus America and all the political aspects, and what is lost is the scenario behind it all. And Odessa is a relatively new city. It was founded in 1795 by Catherine the Great, and a gentleman called the Duc de Richelieu did planning, and there are trees everywhere. It's absolutely beautiful. The city parks are massive. And apparently, I have it on good authority, there's only one road which hasn't got trees in it. But they're not just trees, any trees. These trees were purposely collected from all over because apparently the land was steppe. It's fertile, beautiful black soil, beautiful agricultural land. But there were very few trees, so I noticed so many varieties of trees, I really couldn't name them. Some I knew, some were completely unknown to me. And so that together with the architecture, which is sort of French, Italian type style, very, very beautiful. I couldn't stop taking photographs of the buildings because they were so gorgeous. So the context behind what is happening now is a really beautiful city. A cafe society, people go out at night, have their pizzas and their coffees and what have you. The streets are buzzing with music, and it's a really gorgeous place to be. You felt good, you felt safe, vibrant. This whole thing going on, and underneath, biting at the heels of this beautiful city full of really friendly people, is this undercurrent of fascism. these armed gangs, armed and allowed to be armed by the government, by the unelected people who run the city, who actually are appointed rather than elected. And we witnessed the fascist gangs marching through the city, and there were a lot of them. I mean, how many would you say, Joe, were there in that first march that we saw?
There were about 1,000 people, I think.
Yeah, roughly 1,000, which is quite a lot. Shouting, chanting, hang the communists from the trees. I mean, and there was something really not nice about these people. Mostly male, mostly young. And later on, there was the torchlight part of this whole rally, which was so reminiscent of what happened in Germany in the early 1930s. And it was quite frightening to be standing there, watching this chanting, watching them lighting their torches, incidentally, with the right hand in this way, all as one, 1,000 people, and we were greatly concerned, and we understand now why it is so important for the people who invited us, who needed international people to come out and do exactly what we're doing today, telling the story of what's really going on in Ukraine, that this undercurrent of fascism, people wearing swastikas openly in the streets, this undercurrent is bubbling there, and the government is actually encouraging it. The police stand back and do nothing. And I think Joe will probably tell you a little more now about what happened at the House of Trade Unions 5 years ago, and really was a catalyst for our invitation to Odessa at this time.
Okay. You want to talk about that, Joe? What happened 5 years ago?
Well, pretty much what I said. These people came in from throughout the country, a lot of right-wingers. Odessa is primarily a Russian-speaking area, Russian ethnicity. Russian is the major language in Ukraine. Ukrainian is a secondary language. However, the very first act they did after the coup on Maidan was to ban the Russian language. They had to back off from that because there was international pressure saying you really can't do this when the majority speaks Russian, to tell them they can't speak their language and that it's illegal to speak their language. So they did back off from it. But mainly the people that were Russian speaking were against the coup that took place in Kiev. But for this football game, people came from around the country, and although the fascist movement was not very big in Odessa, they increased their forces by people coming from throughout the country. And this happened when we were there too. The march that Pippa talked about of 1,000 people was people coming in from throughout the country. They bust in to do this march. And really, although there were 1,000 people, it did not compare to the numbers of people that were there to commemorate the killings and were actually on the other side. All day long, people came by past the House of Trade Unions and left flowers. It was just a continual stream of thousands and thousands of people. And then at 4 o'clock, the family members of the people that died showed up, and it became kind of a big mass of people that came there. And the family members had a sound system which they wanted to address the crowd, and the police would not let them turn on their sound system. However, when the fascists marched later on, the police let them use their sound system in the middle of the city to give their speeches and to play their militaristic music. There were also at 4 o'clock and earlier when we were there were groups of fascists that were there, people with swastikas on their clothes, and they were there to kind of deny the right of these families to commemorate the dead, and also to intimidate them. So at one point we made a mistake, actually. We went up about, we were there at 2 or 1 or 2, and then we came back at 4 when there were, at 1 or 2 we went up to these fascists that were standing there and just wanted to ask them, what are you doing?
These are people actually wearing swastikas.
Wearing swastikas.
I mean,
and
Were they carrying weapons?
no, not that I could see.
Okay.
Oh, actually, coming into the park, the area where this was taking place, the police made people go through some security, and they had a bucket of weapons that they took from people that were standing there. So hopefully there were no... The police were all around, but the police let the fascists do this kind of aggression. And so we walked up to a couple of them and said, you know, basically, what are you doing here? And they said, well, these people are not Ukrainians, they're all Russians, all the people that were there. And the people that were killed, they were Russian too, which is simply not true. They were all Ukrainians that were killed. And so this was an anti-Russian thing. So these fascist gangs, they're anti-Russian, they're anti-Jewish, and they're anti-other minority populations in Ukraine. And Ukraine has a lot of minority populations, Polish, Moldavian, and many, many others. And many of them have left the country because of intimidations by these people.
Well, there's a new development in Ukraine. They have a new president, right? Vladimir Zelensky, who's also a comedian and more or less a populist, not a career politician. And I think he speaks Russian.
Yeah, he not only speaks Russian, he's Jewish.
So how do you think this is going to add to the mix? What do you think this means?
Well, the people that were our hosts, we talked to them, they're not so sure that this is going to mean anything, because he is also supported by money and oligarchs. However, he got 4 times the number of votes as Poroshenko, the past president. And the past president ran on a very hard line. We're going to take Crimea back. We're going to destroy the people in the East who have kind of more or less broken away from Ukraine. They really want autonomy in their region, in a region called Donbass, and they've formed what is called the People's Republic of Donetsk and the People's Republic of Lugansk, and stop the people in places like Odessa and other places that have been opposed. So this new guy, Zelensky, who is not only Russian-speaking as his primary language and Jewish, he ran against all of that. He said, no, we want to make peace with the people in the East. We want to allow anybody to speak whatever language they want. We don't want to continue this contention with Russia, and we have to recognize that Crimea is really part of Russia and is Russian, and we have to let go of that. And so on that basis, that was his basis, he won by 4 times. He got 75% of the vote, and Poroshenko got 25% of the vote. So I think that was an overwhelming statement from the people of Ukraine. They want to stop what's going on there. And not only that, since the coup, the United States was very much involved in the coup. The first financial minister of Ukraine was an American woman who they made. Biden's son came in and became a leader of the biggest natural gas company there, and they started imposing very strong neoliberal policies there, and it really has hurt the people in great ways. So the population has decreased, incredibly decreased. It's gone from about 55 million to about 35 million as people have left the country. Some of it is intimidation of the national minorities, but most of it is people leaving to try to find a better life somewhere else because it doesn't seem to, the economy doesn't seem to sustain a lot of people there. And a lot of people that we met who were even, against the coup, who were anti-Maidan people is the term that they use. A lot of them have to function underground because of the fascists. In fact, the person that invited us She was put on a fascist list on the internet, and she had to leave the country while we were there because otherwise she would have been either assassinated or jailed. So many of these people have left the country and do not like what's going on there.
Yeah, can I just chip in my little bit here about the ethnicity? Because, as Joe said, there are people living in the Ukraine from all over. But there's also been dramatic changes in population in the past. In the days of forced collectivization, I made a note here of the numbers because I'm not massively good at remembering numbers. That actually in 1932 to 1933, 7 million died. I'm talking about Odessa. Okay, so what we're talking about is a huge problem where the population has constantly been on the move. I mean, there was a huge population of Jewish people. It's a very, very tolerant place compared with other places around Europe at the time. But a third of the population, which was Jewish, was sent to labor camps or deported to the gulags. There were 25,000 people, not all Jewish, who were either hanged or who were burned to death. I mean, this is all part of the history of this city, which seems to not be able to deal with extremist forces, possibly partly because of its very beauty, although I must say that the Allied forces did bombard it, the British in particular. I don't know how it managed to survive, but I think it was the port that was mainly bombarded, because of course that's where the wealth of the city is, this great gateway, this huge port, this deep water port. So I think that, you know, you've got a place where on the one hand you've got beautiful surroundings, on the other hand you have a very tolerant population, but on the third hand you have these forces coming in and creating havoc at exactly the same time. And this is the dichotomy of Odessa, and this is why it's really important that we talk about what's happening, because the corruption, certainly that we heard from every corner, the corruption is rife in politics. And I think that whilst people expect so little from their politicians, they obviously are moving forward in hope with the election of this new man who has currently suspended Parliament and is trying to give people time to either let their politicians show their worth or re-elect new politicians in an attempt to get rid of this inherent corruption, which is both destroying the economy of the country but also destroying the society of the country through enabling these armed right-wing groups of people to flourish and openly wear their Nazi symbols in the streets. It must be horrifying to walk through your own city and see swastikas being, dare I say it, proudly worn by these youths, and to know that your administration, your politicians and your police are doing worse than nothing. They're just allowing it. And this is the problem of the massacre 5 years ago, where the police stood back. In fact, we took eyewitness testimony from people and we recorded it, which showed that which told us that the police were actually asked to put all their cell phones on silent. They weren't allowed to know what was going on. When the House of Trade Unions was being burned and people were trying to get out and being beaten and thrown back in again, the fire engine took an hour and a half. Now, we walked the distance from the from the fire station to the House of Trade Unions, and it was about a 5-minute walk. It took them an hour and a half to get there. Those people were allowed to burn to death. And this is the enormous tragedy when your politicians and your governance systems let you down time and time again. And they are frightened. And it's our job to say what's happening in Kiev, in Odessa, in the Ukraine is not what's being reported on your television screens or your radios. It is not a straightforward Europe-Russia tangle. It is a myriad of different forces all vying for position in a corrupt place where your chief of police will take money from everybody and still let people be murdered and burned alive on the streets. So we need to get this out there. And although there is hope that a new Prime Minister can change things, we all know realistically that corruption, which goes right through the fibres of society, is very hard to get rid of. But let's be sure that we've been asked to come here and tell this story, and it is our job to make sure that our people, maybe not our government, don't stand aside and let it happen, that we support those who are working in the resistance against fascism. Because, once fascism gets a hold in Ukraine, it will spread.
Right.
We've seen this with ISIS across the Middle East.
Right.
Fascism takes different guises, but it's always repression, it's always murder, it is always fear, and we don't want to see that anywhere.
We have about 7 or 8 minutes left. So I wanted to just ask you if you see any parallels between the far right in Ukraine and the far right here in the U.S., because we're starting to see swastikas here.
Well, yeah. A report I wrote for UNAC on the way after we were there, one of the demands we put in the end of the report was end fascism from Charlottesville to Odessa. And fascism is on the rise. I think in many places, the more liberal forces, or even forces that call themselves socialists, have not really dealt with people's problems, with the economy and with war and with other issues. And so people have turned a little bit to the right, and you see the growth of nationalist movements in Europe, and you also see it here, and I think Trump is a reflection of that. When we can have our own president say things like, after Charlottesville, when the Nazis were marching with swastikas and doing torchlight marches and fascist salutes, well, there's good people on both sides. When he can say something like that, it becomes a green light for a lot of these people.
Mm-hmm.
And groups like the Ku Klux Klan endorsed Trump. And so this is the direction that some things seem to be going. But unfortunately, there's not the opposition to it in some of the opposition parties that there really needs to be. And not only does Trump and the U.S. government think there's good people here, but it's the U.S. arms that these people are carrying as they fight the war in Donbass, as that the fascists have gotten. In Kiev, when the right-wing groups came there, they came and were armed. And we heard stories about snipers, and we have a lot of testimony and videos, actually, of some of the people that were the snipers saying who they are and where they came from. They mainly came from outside of Ukraine. Mainly came from the country of Georgia, and they were mainly paid mercenaries to come in and stir up the trouble so they could do this. And this was what the U.S. supported, and the U.S. is now has supported the government that led to the growth of fascism. People like Bandera, who was pro-Nazi during World War II, and formed local Nazi groups in Ukraine that went to the Jewish communities and wiped out Jewish communities in Ukraine, is now honored in Ukraine. They have statues for him. Some of the leaders, one of the people that organized the armed gangs, right-wing gangs in Kiev and Maidan, also is on video giving weapons to the right-wing forces that did the massacre in Odessa. And Odessa was known as a hero city because it held out for so long against the Nazis. And so they still try to celebrate on May 9th what's called Victory Day. But the rest of the country, the Kiev government has no longer made Victory Day, victory over the Nazis, a holiday in there. But so in Kiev and in Odessa and in other places, people celebrate it anyway, and there becomes major problems for them from the right wing for doing this. So this is a fight that is going on, and I do believe that there is a growth of fascism throughout the world, and I think it needs to be opposed. When fascism rose in Germany, it rose at a point when there was severe economic problems, and to get the people thinking away from what are the economic problems and how you solve them and what's the government's role in this, they put all the emphasis on the Jews. And today in Ukraine, they're putting the emphasis, and in other parts of Europe and the United States, on the immigrants. And in Ukraine, also the Jews and the Russians. So it's kind of shifting the sight someplace else. And that's the danger of fascism, developing that kind of prejudice. And it really needs to be fought in Ukraine and throughout Europe and here.
We've got about 3 minutes. Pippa, how can we fight fascism? What do we need to do?
Well, first of all, I think, and Europe is the area where I'm most familiar, is that government, conservative governments, centrist governments, centre-right governments have let people down. And people are looking for an answer to their problems, their economic problems, to their problems with, you know, the next generation coming up, to the environment. Whichever way you look at it, people have been let down, and they will look to alternatives, just like they did in Nazi Germany. I mean, you know, the story has already been told. We don't need to tell it again. We need to wake up. In your case, you've got, you know, the democratic system, which has been overruled time and again through the Electoral College. So you're not getting the people who elected who actually were voted for. We have similarly gerrymandered constituencies where, you know, only a few constituencies are actually going to make a difference. So democracy is letting people down because it's not a true democracy. We need to arrange this, and people need to wake up to why their systems are failing them. They're not going to find the answer at the right, in the fascists, etc., that in France, Germany, across the board are rising. The answer is in holding your democratically elected people to account and getting them to behave as if we are in a real democracy. It's about, I think, getting a far more socialistic view of society, enabling people to work for themselves, enabling people to have more say over their lives. It's not just about wealth redistribution, but it is about taxation. It's about how unfair all these governments are being to people. And they will rise up, but not in the way that you would like.
Right, right. We have less than 2 minutes. Joe, a final word? What do we need to do? What do you want people to do?
Well, I think we need to build a movement. In particular with Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace, we need to build an anti-war movement. Just as with Germany led to World War II as they went into country after country and tried to change the system, our own government is doing that in Venezuela and Iran and Syria and many, many other countries, and we have to oppose that. That's one part of the solution. There's many other parts, and there's many areas. We have wars not just overseas, but what we call wars at home. Black communities are being attacked, immigrants are being attacked, unions are being attacked, women's rights are being attacked, and we have to come together. All these movements come together in a force that can stand up to these attacks and bring about a government that, instead of attacking freedoms and rights of people, will support them and build a better society that way.
Thank you, and thank you both so much. Pippa Bartolotti and Joe Lombardo, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Trudy.
And thank you all for joining us. Hope you'll join us again next time.